All right, we are back for another exciting week of GPS Live. So first off, for everybody watching and tuning in online, this is GPS Live for the week of June 20th or June 30th. What am I doing? I can't even count today. June 30th, 2023. And so to kind of kick things off, my name is Jonathan Singer, and I've got a new guest this week, Alberto. Welcome.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Alberto Rodriguez, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for jumping in. So Tristan is currently out this week, and so Alberta's going to step in. Uh, Fantastic stuff we're going to cover today, this week, and so this is end of quarter for I bet I know for myself and for a lot of folks out there in the cybersecurity world, and all you salespeople that are watching this show. Yeah, you know how I'm talking about. So it's been definitely a busy week for me. How about you, Alberta? How are things going?
Yeah, plus one on that. End of quarter, everything's piling up. Not only that, but the kids are in summer now, so I think everyone's running around trying to figure out how to parent again when the kids are at the house most of the time. So it's been interesting to say the least.
Dude, you're so right. I just feel like I'm noticing kind of like everybody's been on vacation a lot too, a lot of out of offices. So yeah, man, good for everybody. Enjoying the time off. I wasn't sure I'd know what a summer was ever since getting out of school, but hey, whatever. Well, some fun. So to kick things off, we got to do the usual. I have to say this. The views and opinions expressed by the host of this live stream are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official opinions of GuidePoint Security. Now we can get crazy. Um, so, Albert, we were talking a little bit before the show, preparing our show notes, going over our stories for today. I think you're gonna, really love some of the chat. And I'm talking to you, the viewers. You use that comment bar. Use some of those like buttons. We want you to interact. We want to hear from you, and we may even feature you on the show if you have something relevant. Keep the jokes to the minimum, though. Uh, but with that, like let's kind of jump in here. I want to introduce our first story coming to us from Bleeping Computer on EncroChat. This was a takedown from a couple of years ago. They are ceased to be, but we're really starting to get a lot more information that has been released by Interpol about how massive of a network was taken down in this. And this was fairly sophisticated because it was a combination of things, right? Hardware and software services. Is that what you're seeing here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with this story is really interesting that it expanded to so many different individuals and so many different verticals of what these individuals were doing with the chat. So drugs, money laundering, human trafficking, just a whole bunch of different groups that were sort of piggybacking off of the service, which just tells you, like, hey, you can't trust everything that you read, when you go through third parties and you try to kind of use a different part of your business for something else. But just the verticals of the different criminal industries, if you will, was really interesting to me.
Yeah. And so this is totally beyond like our normal hacker chat that we're used to maybe here on the show with like cybercrime focused in maybe like ransomware and very technical stuff. But you're right. We're seeing individuals that maybe aren't necessarily as technical or as tech savvy utilizing a hacker chat high encryption platform to do some of their batty business, right? In this sense. And so for those that are not familiar with EncroChat, when this kind of platform came out several years back, I believe as far back as 2016, um, it was sold as both a cell phone for €1,000, which had all kinds of very interesting hardware, including FIPS 140-2 certified cryptographic engines, um, and a subscription service of €1,500 for a 6 month that included 24/7 support. So, a lot of different types of criminals were taking advantage of this platform. But luckily the good people were able to kind of step in here, right? They did some things. I think they were saying that they cracked both the encryption and just kind of kept an eye on it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, part of that is the whole concept of admissibility in court that factors into this sort of infiltration. From a hacker perspective, I think it's super cool that Interpol was able to get in there however they did and, take down these criminals in these groups. But from like the lawyer legal aspect of things, I'm really curious on when these details come out, if they do, or where they're, kind of discussed. But I'm really interested into how they were able to do it legally, how they were able to bring all that evidence into court and make it admissible, and just how they were able to target so many different individuals and users without essentially breaking the law, right?
Yeah, or getting found themselves. They were kind of like a sleeper cell for a long time because once they made it into the platform and successfully broke the encryption algorithm, they just kind of just collected evidence from that point on. And it sounds like, according to the article, there was kind of a mass migration, right? So after the initial takedown of EncroChat and a lot of those arrests that took place initially, a lot of its users apparently migrated to a different service called Sky ECC. And by no means are we saying you should go out there and look this stuff up because it's of interest, but the idea is that that didn't last long either. In fact, Europol and some other police units were able to also break the encryption of Sky ECC and just continue monitoring a lot of these criminals. It doesn't give them much of a place to hide. And I just, I thought this was an interesting one because we're getting more insight into how, like you said, folks in areas that you normally wouldn't consider technical, aspects of maybe whatever their crime is, are getting into, some of this really deep stuff. Luckily, it's backfiring, but it just goes to show the level of intent people are willing to go to, one, both develop systems and hardware and services to service these people, but also you know, target individuals in all other places, and these bad people looking for things to help them hide. So not so good. But talking about tracking down some things to hide. I'm going to kick off. How about this next story here, coming to us fresh out of the CBC in Canada, which is the Petro Canada, a very large series of chain of gas stations, is suffering what seems like some payment problems, right? Like, what are we seeing here?
Yeah, so this story was one of my favorite from this week because it really kind of opens your eyes to what the potential impact of a cyber breach is. A lot of the times when you read these stories, you look at the ransomware stuff, you look at they held up payment, but what does that actually mean? Well, in
Mhm.
this specific scenario, you know, thousands of stations were unable to accept credit card, card-based payments. And I don't know about the audience, but personally speaking, and a lot of people around me, I think we can all agree that cash is not the most common form of payment. So, you can only imagine from an impact perspective how many dollars they could not collect in the span of those days that they have been on a down state for that respective part of their
It's got to
business.
be a ton of money lost.
Right. Yeah, and that's the big question I have, which obviously will probably never be released. But if you don't collect credit card payments for X amount of days, what does that really mean to you as far as impact? How many millions of dollars did you lose? Then you start getting into the reputational. Will people go back there even after they accept payments? And I'm sure there's an entire analysis done there. There are some interesting metrics that I'm sure this company will need to analyze and solve, from a bigger problem perspective. But yeah, not being able to pay in credit cards definitely puts a hole in your pocket.
No, you're absolutely right. There's a quote from the article where they actually went to one of the gas stations and talked to some of the customers, and they were basically saying, like, look, I can't use my card. I got $20 in my pocket, and that's all I got to fill gas. Like, who carries cash, like you said? And right, it doesn't make sense. When you look at it from like maybe a ransomware perspective, as you mentioned, and so putting this in perspective, I think is going to help a lot of our guests relate, and also a lot of our decision makers kind of take a step back and go, if we couldn't operate for a certain number of days, what is truly the impact of that versus like, okay, yeah, pay me $3 million in Bitcoin, or whatever the ransom is, and we'll give you your data back, or we won't, you know, double extort you, or things of that nature. But following this story, there was information starting to kind of hit the media, more specifically because Petro-Canada has a parent company called Suncor, and so Suncor is believed to also be suffering a cyber incident in the prior week, and so a lot of people are kind of still tying these two together, but the information is still kind of weak in between. So we are going to definitely be following this one pretty closely, and I mean, we've seen this in critical infrastructure. I mean, I would pretty much say in some way, right? Wouldn't you agree? Like, gas, electric, all these things. But even if it's just fuel, is some sort of like critical infrastructure. They're
Yeah,
hitting
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, I would put gas right on top of most critical, parts of our society. When you
Mhm.
look at targeting some of these large gas companies movement, just internal movement, not only from the consumer but also businesses, freight trucks, like, you know boats. I mean, there's just so many different verticals that rely on gasoline and fuel in general to fuel their business, no pun intended.
Yeah.
I think it's so critical, it's so important, and it's very crucial for every sort of country and organizations involved with petroleum to fully understand the impact and to fully do that analysis of what their threat model is. Who's coming after us? How do we better understand our threat? Because that's ultimately going to drive the investment decisions that you make for your company. And it's messy, right? As somebody who lives in Florida, when hurricanes come around and things get crazy and gas runs out, or people are just piling up in the lines, I know how it can impact an entire city, an entire geographic location at the national level. I can't imagine that.
Dude, you're so right, because the article does kind of help us reminisce back on the Colonial Pipeline, issue that hit, and that affected a major area in the southeast United States. 1,500 gas stations across Canada is a whole nother story, and in a sense that we have to keep in mind that regardless of the type of business, computers are involved at some scale, somewhere, somehow along the way, right? And so just because you pump liquid from one location to another, or turn one type of liquid into another type of liquid, doesn't mean you can kind of escape the idea that computers are involved in every aspect of the process. Not just in the manufacturing and the functionality, but the payment collections and the billing and the back office and the everything is it's and so if one of those little pieces gets affected, the whole system kind of gets whacked at the same time. And so we're definitely seeing that. We'll keep an eye for our friends to the north. I hope that things get kind of cleaned up a little bit there. But let's kind of jump into a story here. I picked this one out specifically because it's a play off of a big story that we did last week on the show. And so for those aficionados tuning in online, you'll recall that we discussed new vulnerability called No Auth, or N0 Auth, coming kind of off of the play of OAuth, or OpenAuth. And what this is Grafana, a really popular open source tool, was found to be pretty much vulnerable of this attack. Now, before we kind of jump into this, I do want to reiterate kind of the technical aspect of the attack. If you're familiar with seeing stuff like login with Facebook, login with Twitter, well, Microsoft also has a login with, Azure AD, Office 365, whatever you want to call it these days. And the problem is if an account already exists on that platform that allows the third party authentication, um, you can spoof the email address if you own the Azure AD account. And when you log in, it only just sends over the email, correlates it, and says, "Oh, that email aligns with a valid account that we already have in our system. Here you go." And it merges the two together, and now you have access. So that's a little bit of the technical background on it. But realistically, Grafana is used by a lot of people, right? What are we seeing as far as like the breadth of this?
Yeah, I mean, Grafana is one of those, at least from a pen tester point of view, most companies have an instance somewhere. It seems like,
Hmm.
it's just a very common web application to encounter. I would kind of put it up to speed there with like the Jiras and Confluences of the world, where everywhere you go, you turn an eye and it's there. So it
Yeah.
definitely has a lot of affected individuals and organizations. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, when these vulnerabilities come out for open source tools and they also integrate with a cloud service provider, do you see a benefit in cloud deployed instances being just significantly more beneficial to organization versus self-hosting those open source applications and having everyone to react to when those vulnerabilities come out? So where do you think that split in the industry will start leaning?
So that's a good one, right? And because one's more of like a SaaS focus and one that's self-hosted, right? So first off, we have to get the open source project to deploy a patch, deploy a fix for this. Luckily, right now, for those using Grafana, the vulnerability has been patched. So on the article coming to us from Bleeping Computer, be sure to get to a later version. But with that, like you mentioned, if it's cloud hosted, Grafana Cloud has already upgraded to the latest version across all of its platforms. And it's actively coordinating with people like Amazon and Microsoft to actually get the notifications earlier, um, you know, so before they even go public with a lot of this stuff. Now, right, this is only just one little component, and in a weird way, it kind of is uh, from an outside in, like somebody else has a weakness, therefore it inherently it falls back to whoever uses their code. I also gotta say sorry, but not sorry. The documentation literally says do not use this email field because it can be manipulated and changed, for authentication or validation of sign in. So it's I think it's a little bit on both sides of how it's being handled right now. Uh, you know, Microsoft is very well aware of this on their half. But you said, the best they can do is go into the documentation and say, well, then if you don't do this, you won't have a problem. Kind of kind of leaving it up to them. But that's, as you're asking, that's kind of my take on this. And there are large number of organizations, but Grafana is also built into a lot of platforms too. And I hate to be the purveyor of stuff like SBOM, but SBOM maybe if Grafana is part of your stack, you are also affected by this. But you also have to have that like Microsoft button turned on. Point is something to consider. Um, I'm gonna. How about this? Let's roll into this next article coming to us from MITRE regarding their new approach to. We'll call this the top 25 most dangerous software weaknesses. And I sent this to you earlier in the day and kind of chatted about it. What you had some interesting thoughts, and I'd love to share that with our viewers.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one for me because when these new things come out in the industry, we already have the OWASP top 10, which has been around for a very long time, and
Hmm.
people use it. It's common in like the web application pen testing community and the bug bounty community, where these are things that we focus on because there's a good bang for your buck, a good bang for your time, right? And now I'm looking at a new kind of top something. It's 25 of things that, based on MITRE, are common, impactful, and you should be aware of. And part of that release, you see a lot of adoption, or you start to see who is adopting these types of frameworks or these top whatever list. I think I saw CISA, U.S.
Yeah.
government agency, kind of not retweet, but repost like, hey, if you're an administrator or if you deal with infrastructure, take a look, listen to the recommendation, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm coming at this from an angle of, okay, here comes another thing my way as an administrator or somebody that needs to patch or vulnerability management program or security testing, et cetera, et cetera. I'm getting this new list. where do I put this on the priority list? Do I focus on OWASP top 10 or the MITRE top 25? Do I
The
blend the two?
CS18, which used to be 20, right? Throwing more on your
Right.
plate.
So I'm looking at this from like, okay, I have to analyze it, I have to dissect it. It's going to eventually end up on some resource or potentially some compliant requirement that I need to adhere to, at least take into consideration. um, Not trying to say I'm lazy and there's just extra work to be done, more so what's the value of the list from a priorities of work kind of standpoint, and where is this going to sit on the other list, that I have to account for.
Yeah, and so you mentioned SZA there because what's happening is MITRE is almost in a sense cataloging a particular vulnerability to what SZA does is called the known exploited vulnerabilities or KEV catalog, and so they're saying kind of like, hey, this number one common weakness enumeration, ID'd as CWE 787, has been seen in the kev 70 times, right? And so that's kind of helping say like, all right, well, there's a little bit of weight in this direction because it's very popular, or like you said, impactful, whatever it may be. Just kind of highlighting and looking through some of these, right? It's a little bit all over the place. You said we had the OWASP top 10 for web app, and this is not just web app because then there's also other types of vulnerabilities. So this is like a little bit of everything. Like for instance, number one, out of bounds right. That's a kind of like almost like a fancy way of saying like a buffer overflow. Or if you take like a set of memory and it's allocated to a certain size, then it would be safe to assume that there's other memory allocations somewhere around it, and you could potentially write out to those other sections of memory. Um, and I agree that's a huge vulnerability. We're still dealing with that to this day, regardless of all the different types of operating system level fixes that we're doing in our memory these days. And but then number two is cross-site scripting, complete opposite end of the spectrum. One's binary, one's web. Were there any of these that kind of popped out to you that you'd like to share? Maybe some of your favorite types of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so yeah, spot on the fact that it's sort of different in the sense of categories of flaws or security findings. The one of the interesting ones I saw was just regarding hard-coded credentials. Like that's
Hmm.
not necessarily a software flaw, more so a bad practice by a developer or SRE or DevOps, kind of personnel within the organization. But it just, to me, it seems like it's in a lot of different verticals. And as an administrator or somebody responsible for rectifying, security flaws within my organization, I'd want that to be kind of tightened up a little bit more, from just the perspective of what should I focus on, right? They do have number 1 through 25, but it seems to be in too many different verticals, at least in my eyes. Aside from the hard coded credentials, they talked about code execution being one of them. Well, that's, across every software period, like code execution is never good. So, yeah, good to know. But a lot of the time, especially with SaaS taking over, you just using third party software in general, that's not up to you to really rectify. You're more of the consumer of the product. So I don't know. The list is interesting.
It is, and actually, I'll use your example of hard-coded credentials because I'm just thinking about the places that can apply to. That can apply at the manufacturing and hardware level. For instance, if you're burning cryptographic keys into chips, or if you're writing firmware for hardware, we've seen so many like routers and
Like
home
all of them.
consumer equipment. All of them, yeah, get backdoored because somebody finds a hard-coded password from the manufacturer in the firmware, or leaving a cryptographic key behind, at least the private key, a number of different things. So yeah, so you're right. How do you say this particular concern, well, then it applies to you, and you do something about it. You can't simplify it down and say, hey, everybody in web needs to be aware of, the OWASP top 10. So, uh, I think it's going to be interesting. I agree. Let's see where it goes. They do, have some kind of year-over-year trending. They are tracking those known vulnerability alignments with CISA, and they do, provide some good background. Right, I do like to see when CVEs, for example, from Lighter, have a very nice detailed description and definition and how it works, and they've put together some great documentation, even examples of what bad code potentially looks like in some cases, to help people really kind of grasp these concepts and be able to say, okay, I may not be super technical, but I see what you're trying to say here. Thanks for sharing it. So a little bit of time, just yeah, add it to your list, right? Another one on the plate. Top you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna do a top list. So being partial to OWASP, I'm gonna put the OWASP top 10 for application security at the top of my top list. Do you have a favorite top list?
I could never think through. There's so many lists. It ain't happening.
Man, well, for those of you tuning in online and also in the future, go ahead and post it down in the comments. We'd love to hear what's the top of your top list, because somebody somewhere needs to care about this stuff. I just wish it would come together in some sense. Uh, but in good fashion, we'd like to try to end off this. We started with some good news. Let's go ahead and end it with some good news, where one of the individuals responsible for getting the Twitter pop back in 2020 has been sentenced. If for those that don't recall, about 3 years ago, a group of individuals were able to kind of social engineer their way into Twitter and just started posting on very famous people's accounts, right? The article goes on to give some detail about what they did. Do you remember when this happened?
Yeah, this was definitely a fun topic back on the Twitter land during the pandemic. But high net worth or very popular individuals such as President Barack Obama, Kanye West, etc. Uh, the security community knew what was going on, but folks were kind of like, "Whoa, what is going on?" When President Barack Obama is asking you to say, "Hey, send me some Bitcoin. I'm going to give you double it back." Like, yeah, like that ain't happening. But unfortunately, a lot of people fell for it, and unfortunately, a lot of good, hardworking folks were scammed out of money. So it's good to see some justice in place for that activity.
Yeah. No, you're right. There was a number of people who kind of fell for the double back scam, is what we'll call it, that you see on some social media, where if you send X amount, you get 2X in return, which we can all safely and hopefully assume is a scam here. Um, the attackers had what they considered called God mode, essentially, where once they were into Twitter infrastructure, they could basically do whatever they wanted. And that's where the step from like breaching a company and maybe responsible disclosure bug bounty, as you mentioned, turned into greed, right? You had a thought about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these types of stories are really interesting just from a society perspective where, these individuals were young, maybe you're young as well, and you're going through those thoughts of, should I take that step of doing something that is criminal in nature or just not in good faith? This is kind of to showcase that if you do jump over to the dark side, if you will, a Star Wars reference there, there are some repercussions, and it's not just the jail time or the fines. It's also understanding the impact that you are potentially having on individuals. I would argue some of those individuals that send money were probably taking a leap of faith. Maybe that's the last $1,000 they had, and they were just hoping for something good to happen in their life. So there's kind of that human aspect you need to think about as you make your decision to join the dark side.
Yeah, man. Well, uh, cybercrime is never a good thing, and it will always catch up with you if that's what we've learned. And with that brings us to the end of another amazing week here at GPS Live. Again, this is for June 30th. got it correct this time, of 2023. It's been an absolute pleasure, Alberto. Really, seriously, thank you for joining this week. Looking forward to the feedback from our fans.
Yeah, thanks for
Uh,
having
we're not going to be too mean on the criticism, but I know I had a great time, and so we'll definitely have you back. And so with that, I am Jonathan Singer, and I appreciate everybody joining. And with that, Alberta, you want to tell everybody have a good one.
me. Yeah, thanks for having me. Have a great and safe weekend, everyone. Take care.
Take care, and for those in the United States, enjoy the holidays next week with Fourth of July. Uh, with that, I guess we'll try with these. Enjoy. Take care. Peace out.
See
Bye
you.
bye.